I will take out a pen and write things on a piece of paper, and magic will happen, and there will be more of the thing. Hey there, friends, fans, and foes of Dad Saves America. John Popola here, and this Friday, I can't help but dive into this question of price controls. I know Kamala Harris has talked about all kinds of things she wants to do and give out to Americans last night, but I can't get past the fact, honestly, that we as a society haven't gotten past this horrible idea.
When I am elected president, I will make it a top priority to bring down costs and increase economic security for all Americans. As president, I will take on the high costs that matter most to most Americans, like the cost of food. Look, I know most businesses are creating jobs, contributing to our economy, and playing by the rules. But some are not, and that's just not right.
Some are playing by the rules and some are not. What rules are these exactly? There's some assumption here that there's some hidden rule book of fairness, but we won't define what those rules are. I don't know what rules she's saying are being broken in our food supply at the level of pricing, but I don't think she does either. I think this is just rhetoric.
And we need to take action when that is the case. I will work to pass the first ever federal ban on price gauging on food.
Little slip up there from the teleprompter, price gauging. It's price gouging, but it's a stupid idea regardless of how you pronounce it.
My plan will include new penalties for opportunistic companies that exploit crises and break the rules. We will help the food industry become more competitive.
I'm really curious how you're going to simultaneously dictate all the prices in the food system, the foundation of all of human life, but also make them more competitive. I'm not sure where your special agriculture wizardry is going to come in here to make food industries more competitive, but I'm sure that's also equally elusive, let's say, as elusive as policy positions beyond this speech have been running up to this moment.
Because I believe competition is the lifeblood of our economy.
She's right about that. She is right about that. That's about it.
More competition means lower prices for you and your families.
That's right.
Now is the time to chart a new way forward.
Forward we go, always forward. Let's chart a new way forward. Not a lot new going on in this way forward. Not a lot new at all. In fact, as I said, this is quite old.
Every American family is confronted with a real and pressing problem of higher prices.
Yes.
And I have decided that the time has come to take strong and effective action to deal with that problem. Effective immediately, therefore, I am ordering a freeze on prices. This freeze will hold prices at levels no higher than those charged during the first 8 days of June. It will cover all prices paid by consumers.
I am not a crook. There's something in our politics that gives rise to rank idiocy, to policies that cannot work on the basis of Econ 101. Here's the thing about what prices actually are, and this happens to be something I've spent a bunch of time thinking about because I'm an econ nerd, and that is that prices are actually information. That's what prices are. Yes, any individual price is what one person or one company is trying to make on the product they sell, but they don't actually have as much power to determine that price as people think. Consider this. PlayStation, currently version 5. When PlayStation 6 comes out at some point in the next couple of years, they will charge, let's say, $500 in today's dollars for this new version of the PlayStation. It will get hyped for months in advance. We will approach the Christmas season, and you will struggle to find a PlayStation on the shelf. Why is that? That's because the demand for the PlayStation is higher than that price allows to keep on the shelf. If you want to buy a PlayStation 6 when it comes out, what you're going to have to do is go on eBay or one of these other secondary markets and pay double that. That is the price. That's the actual price. That's the market price. And that's actually an example of a kind of price control that's being imposed by the company on themselves, even though they know that it's not really going to work and they're not going to be able to fill the shelves and keep them full for all of their customers. Some of that might be on purpose to, create this illusion of demand that outstrips supply, when in reality, they probably could have supplied enough to meet the demand. Whatever the case may be, it's a perfect example that most of us, if you're a nerd, have experienced, where the price that's been set doesn't allow what economists say the market to clear. So you see the real price is quite a bit higher, the price that people are willing to pay. We have seen this time and time again throughout history. When the government legally says you shall not, under force of law, pay any more than X arbitrary price that we have set from Washington on the basis of political nonsense and gobbledygook, all hell breaks loose. In the 1970s, we had lines around the block to fill your gas tank. My parents were old enough to experience this firsthand. I was born in 77, so, this was already starting to ease before my birth. But why did that happen? There were embargoes, the OPEC was restricting the supply of oil. But primarily in the US, there were lines around the block, not in other places. And the reason is that when supply went down and the price began to creep up, price control said you're not allowed to do that. You're not allowed to charge more than X politically set random price. And so the information system about supply and demand was short-circuited, and there wasn't enough to go around, just like the PlayStation at Christmas time at launch. And so you get lines. You actually still are paying the price. You're paying the price with your time instead of your dime. So that's the other thing about the reality of prices. You will pay the price. You might pay it in pain because you can't get the thing you need when you need it most. You might pay it in hunger, or in the case of medicines, you might pay it in death if you can't get the thing you need because of price controls. But price controls will do that. They can't stop the laws of supply and demand, which is a fancy way of saying the reality that people want and need things, and the things they want and need at any given time are scarce. Those are just the economic facts of reality. And we have become a kind of post-reality society when it comes to our politics. That's the only way I can really understand the moment we're in, where here we are at one of our two parties' national conventions, and their nominee has not posted any public policies that she is advocating for, aside from mouthing off about price controls. A couple other things that are important to understand about this particular problem. So yes, Nixon did exactly this thing during the early inflation of the 1970s. Didn't work. Prices kept going up. The 1970s was called stagflation for a reason. High inflation and high unemployment. That was stagflation. We actually experienced that again in the aftermath of COVID. But going after the food supply, of all the things to attack with price controls, is like ignorance stacked upon ignorance. And I get it, it's populist, it's the thing that hits people's pocketbooks, so it sounds great to the economically uneducated, but that just means you're exploiting people. And there was a great clip from the All In podcast that talked a little bit about just how weird and stupid and ignorant this kind of targeting of the food industry in particular is.
Agriculture and food markets have insanely competitive dynamics because there are commodity markets, there are tons of competitors. There is no monopoly in making food, there is no monopoly in making CPG products, there is no monopoly in retail, there is no monopoly in grocery stores. It is a small margin, highly competitive, highly fragmented, free market. And the free market works in that everyone is always competing with each other, creating new productivity improvements, and as a result, over time, prices come down, except when the government intervenes and gets involved.
So as he was saying, the food industry, while not a perfect free market, is highly competitive. There's a lot of suppliers, there's a lot of buyers. There are also actually beaten and bludgeoned by the ups and downs of commodity prices. Several years back, my wife Lisa and I produced a documentary called At the Fork, which you can actually see on YouTube, and it's available kind of everywhere on Amazon and the like, where we traveled the country seeing the way animal-based food production was handled. I've spent more times in a slaughterhouse than I care to. I've seen the way our food system works literally firsthand. And these are very, very hard businesses to stay alive in, even with all the subsidies. In fact, American populism in some ways was born in agriculture as a result of the booms and busts of the weather. And the fact that crop failures would not just destroy particular farms and farmers, but would take out entire communities. Because what would happen is all the farms in the local area would take out loans from the local bank, plant their seeds, buy their feeds, water, grow, care for their livestock. And if you had a bad year, if it's the time of the Depression and there's a dust bowl, not only do you all go broke when the crop yields fail, but the banks all go bust and everything goes into a deflationary spiral. So out of that came a lot of economic populism. A man named William Jennings Bryan, a populist progressive politician, was advocating for inflationary monetary policy to essentially bail out farmers that were stuck in debt from the booms and busts of agriculture. Agriculture is a hard business. Price controls will only make it that much harder. And it's just one more way that distant top-down planners think they know better than the decentralized information system of people engaged in free exchange. That's all that the free enterprise system is. People engaged in free exchange. So we've tried this plenty of times in this country. It has caused massive pain and problems in this country. Shortages, gas lines, and the like. We see it crop up every time there is an acute crisis. So for example, during COVID, and this has gone off on Twitter a couple times, President Trump himself, or President Trump's administration at the very least, instituted a price gouging executive order, because that's what politicians do. Oh, prices are spiking for a thing that suddenly a bunch of people need right now. I know what I'll do. I will take out a pen and write things on a piece of paper, and magic will happen. And there will be more of the thing or less of the demand because I wrote something down on a piece of paper, because I signed a piece of paper and flooded it off into the 3 million people that work in the executive branch to stumble around and bump into each other for the next 48 months. But this happens. It happens on both sides. It happens all the time. It's always bad. It never works. But sometimes it never works in ways that are really atrocious. And, well, we just have to look south of the border to see just how bad it can get.
In his weekly program, President Maduro announced reforms to the Fair Prices Law. The changes include 2 new kinds of price controls. One covers the whole economy and refers to a maximum price for sale to the public. The other gives special protection for food and medicines. The president also announced new penalties for those traders who break the Fair Prices Law and engage in price speculation. Increased fines will be applied directly to the company's gross income, and in some cases they could face prison sentences.
Ah, yes, the traders that charge more than the dictator thinks they should charge. Off to prison for you. People can say that talking about these policies like price controls and calling them communism is hyperbole, but they are the road to communism. They are a form of central planning of the entire society, not just the economy, the society. You're not allowed to do the things you need to do to survive under penalty of imprisonment. That is what these things are. What happens if by some unlikely turn of events, Kamala Harris is elected president and actually does any of this? The likelihood of which I think is probably pretty low. This is all just pandering. She's not probably going to do any of it. So they make a lot of promises, then they go into the back room and say, well, we're not really going to do that because I did actually take economics. I heard somebody that took economics and they explained it to me over coffee. And so I know I'm not really going to do that. But I'm going to say that that's what we're going to do. How do you think it worked out for Venezuela?
Venezuela, of course, a country where prices double every few weeks and a monthly salary isn't enough to buy meat for one family meal. That's why the government has knocked those 5 zeros off the refurbished bolivar in a desperate attempt to control hyperinflation.
Again, the only thing these people have is their pen. Oh, prices have gone too high. I know what I'm going to do. I'm just going to take a Sharpie marker and give me that dollar you got. I'll just I'll knock a couple zeros off it. Boom. Problem solved. Now you can afford to live. This is what they got. Words and more words. But words don't pay the bills. Words don't feed your family. And Maduro's words didn't produce anything but absolute misery and collapse.
We know that the GDP, the gross domestic product, which is the measure of everything a country produces in a year, went down since 2015 by about 70 to 80%. So let that number sink in. Like the economy collapsed by 70 to 80%.
And this is the pain that gets inflicted by these people and their pens. They can say things, they can sign their name to things, but they create nothing. And if you've got enough political power, if you're Maduro or you're one of the Peronists that came into once wealthy Argentina and burned the country to the ground in the name of left-wing populism. Argentina, by the way, was arguably on a path to being as rich or richer than the United States at the turn of last century. And now it is a basket case where things got so bad, they actually elected and self-admitted anarcho-capitalist that names his dogs after free market economists. That's how bad it gets when you adopt economic populism in the name of just pandering to people that don't know any better. That's what happens. That's the path we would be on if a couple other things weren't going on. First, why is this going on? Since corporate greed never really makes sense as an explanation. Why are prices so high at the grocery store? Let's imagine for a minute that it was corporate greed. As Elizabeth Warren loves to say. All this talk of greed from Elizabeth Warren is really rich, considering that she was pulling down like a $400,000 salary for teaching like one class at Harvard. Spare me your talk of greed, shall we? But the fact is, if greed is the source of the problem, why did companies get greedier during the Biden-Harris administration? And why were companies less greedy during the Trump administration? That's the implication of this claim that it's corporate greed that drove prices up. Is it corporate greed when prices go down? Was it corporate greed when gas prices fell during the pandemic? Or when they fell in the prior 5 years? Did OPEC get less greedy? Did Exxon get less greedy? Or is that explanation basically equivalent to blaming airplane crashes on gravity, which is what it is? That's what it is. Oh, why did the plane fall out of the air? Because of gravity. It's like, well, yes, it is because of gravity, except gravity is always there. So that's actually not the explanation, is it? The actual reason why prices are up is pretty straightforward if you know anything about the institutions of our economy. Our price level is determined by the Federal Reserve, period. That's what it's determined by. It's not actually determined by the Treasury. It's not directly determined by government spending. That's also false. It's determined by the Fed. How do I know that? Well, aside from economic theory and all of human history, it's impossible to ignore because, in case you haven't noticed, inflation actually has come down as a year-over-year growth. Inflation year-over-year is now almost back to where it was before the pandemic. And yet deficit spending is super crazy out of control. So deficits don't cause inflation. Money printing does. Here is the Fed's balance sheet. So when the Federal Reserve creates money, it could just literally print dollars and mail them to you. That, economists call this helicopter money after Ben Bernanke talking about dropping money from helicopters. But that's not actually typically what they do. What they do is they go out into the market, financial markets, and they buy assets, mostly treasuries. And they mostly buy treasuries from existing holders of treasuries, not the treasury itself. They buy it from banks and private individuals that have treasury bills. And as you can see, starting in March 2020, the balance sheet of the Fed went to crazy town. It was already in crazy town post financial crisis in 2008. So you can kind of see, if you go back a little further, the Fed's balance sheet by today's standards was below $1 trillion. Bailouts for the financial crisis shot that up to $2.5 trillion. And then quantitative easing in 2013 kept it going, took all the way up to $4.5 trillion. Now, we didn't see a big inflation at that time for complex reasons, but one of which is the way the Fed actually pays banks interest on the reserves that they print. It's called sterilizing the money, but needless to say, that's not what happened in 2020. The Fed went from a balance sheet that had been going down at $4.2 trillion. In the matter of a couple months, it went up by almost $3 trillion. It almost doubled. And then in the subsequent year, from May 2020 all the way up to May 2021, it was almost at $8 trillion. And it peaked, wouldn't you know it, around April 2022 at almost $9 trillion. That happens to correspond with the rise of inflation. And then the Fed has since been pulling back, reducing its balance sheet, tightening monetary policy, which has led to higher interest rates. And so it is starting to come back down. But notice something. The Fed's balance sheet is still at the heightened level of where it was in the immediate aftermath of early COVID in 2020. That's why your grocery bill is elevated. That's why it has stopped growing in price really quickly, month over month, year over year, but it still hurts. It hasn't come down. This is why. It isn't anything that agencies can do. So President Trump said, I'm going to tell all the agencies to try to fight for lower prices. That's nonsense. That's not true. That's not a thing. This is the thing. This is where overall prices are determined by the Fed. So here's the other problem. And this is the problem that touches on all the other free stuff that both Kamala Harris and to a lesser extent, Donald Trump is promising you. And by free stuff, I mean not making any changes to any of our entitlements like Social Security and Medicare, or expanding this or that tax credit, which is just cutting checks to people like the child tax credit, or forgiving student loans, or paying off your mortgage or helping you with your initial mortgage assistance, all this extra new stuff on top of the stuff that's already being spent. There's no money for that. There's no money. Every single nickel of every new dollar that is promised must be borrowed. That is a fact. Anyone claiming otherwise is a liar. And the thing that's so crazy about the moment we're in right now, as we sit here in August of 2024, is that we're several years into what is called a boom, or at least a recovered economy. Relatively low unemployment, reasonable economic growth by modern standards, which is to say, not great. But essentially, we're not in a recession, and yet, last year and this year, we are running some of the biggest deficits as a share of our economy that we've seen in peacetime. And it's only getting worse. Here is the federal deficit. Take a look at the trend on that sucker. This is each year how much money is spent and borrowed. And it is a nasty looking picture. My least favorite modern economist, who's actually an economist as opposed to, say, Karl Marx, who's just basically a satanic theologian, he had an idea. And his idea about how the government should operate with booms and busts goes something like this. In bad times, the government should borrow money to cushion the blow and maintain demand. And in good times, the government should run a surplus and build up reserves for the bad times. That is what John Maynard Keynes' full picture actually was. Now, most of Keynes's ideas aren't that great, and the ones that are good aren't unique to him. But you're not even being a good Keynesian when you run this level of debts and deficits in the so-called good times. What's going to happen when we run into a recession or when we have another financial crisis? We don't have a lot of room for where to go from here. So Venezuela destroys itself and announces crackpot policies that should have died 150 years ago, but are popular to the untrained ear. I'm going to lower prices because I'm a magical dictator, and it wrecks their society. We have what has been called an exorbitant privilege, an expensive privilege. And that is that we are the richest country on earth. We have the biggest military. We have arguably the most productive capacity. We have brilliant people. We have a large land mass. We have energy and agriculture. We have kind of everything we need. And I'm for free trade, so I'm not saying we should be autarkic here. But as a country, in terms of assets, in terms of capabilities, we've got a lot. And as Adam Smith said, there's a lot of ruin in a nation. So our current situation appears to be that our political class operates more or less like spoiled brat trust fund kids who've inherited their parents' money, have no idea how to be productive or useful, and are blowing it on blow and boats. That's what's going on. And actually, they do this for themselves. They do the blow and the boats for themselves. But in addition to that, their other form of blow, their other drug that they're addicted to, is promising you things they know they can't really do. And the most likely outcome of these is that the country will start to get poorer per capita. You can't just spend down and eat all the seed corn and run down the trust fund, both literal and figurative, and be better off. You eventually run out of other people's money. You eventually load up the productive engines of our economy, which is to say the people and our capacity to produce things. You eventually outstrip it to such an extent that our knees buckle and start to bend. And that is what we get with this exorbitant privilege. We are having our backs loaded up with promises that are taking from our back pocket to put into our front. And unless we wake up to that, we're just going to get run off a cliff. It is our fault to the extent that we, and I know like we is kind of this nonsense word, right? Who's we? We. That's really what this is all ultimately about. That's the sort of collectivist togetherness. We, off we go into the future. We. That's what we're told. We can do it. We can make it happen. We can build an entire new kind of economics on the basis of we. That's the childishness that we are dealing with now in our politics. And I hope we can wake up from it, because if we don't, it's going to be very painful for us and our kids. So with that, let me know what you think in the comments below. As you know, if you're a returning viewer, I jump in there and mix it up with you. So I'm looking forward to your comments and your criticisms and all the rest. Have a great weekend.
I can paint you a picture of how that would work and how it's worked in the past, where we've tried to artificially hold prices down. Competition doesn't come in. People don't, like if beef is too high, people don't move the chicken. The competitors don't come in to undercut where the beef prices are. Nothing works when you try to artificially control prices. It's just a supply and demand issue. It's a flawed idea.
So did you have a question here?